Involvement of KPFA in the local community was partly a question of its ideology. It was partly a question of the technology that came online. Because in order to cover things that were happening in Berkeley and in San Francisco, the first thing that was necessary for it to be anything other than a talkathon of people coming in and talking about how terrible things were, or how wonderful things were, was the evolution of the battery-operated tape recorder. And from the early 1960s onward, there were some bulky and not terribly good, but actually serviceable machines, such as the Butoba, which it practically took 6 pallbearers to take out onto the scene, but it was possible to do it. And this was before the days of the ubiquitous ewer. But these machines, although the quality was bad, it was necessarily there. You could go out with a battery-packed machine on over your shoulder and a microphone, and you could be there while students were being washed down the steps of the City Hall in 1960, and later on while Mario Savio was on top of that police car in Sproul Plaza giving his famous talk, and throwing yourself on the gears and all that stuff. And I still have in my possession a briefcase with an egg stain on the side of it from an egg thrown at Mario Savio on top of that police car. And it's one of my most prized possessions because I was there with the microphone up in his face taking that down. And a little later on, Joan Baez introducing to the group a new song by a young chap named Bob Dylan, a song called Blowin' in the Wind, and thought that they might find it kind of relevant to what was going on. I mean, this was the kind of history that was happening. Now, I've skipped over about a 5-year period there, but this was happening, all the time, and because of the technology, people were able to go out and capture this stuff. And like anything, once you can do it, you have to do it. And they were, of course, they were dedicated. This was, and it was also the fact that in those days, the major newscasters just weren't interested in this. This was not their territory. They didn't want to cover it. They were scared out of their wits at this material. But there was KPFA out there with their microphones and their tape recorders and rushing the stuff back to the studios, and armies of people on aged Ampexes cutting it up and putting it on the air virtually as soon as the splice had gone onto the tape. And this was one of those many moments. These were those moments in which KPFA suddenly had everybody in town riveted to their radio sets, and it was always these moments of crisis, not necessarily just the crisis of the station, which is there always, but the crisis of the community, when the listenership went up, the subscriptions went up, when people realized this is our lifeline to what is happening in Berkeley and in the Bay Area. Well, I was just one of a number. There were an army of us out there. And somebody else may have been there at that point on the other side, also recording it for KPFA, but we weren't coordinated. We just go out there and get what you can get, and we were sort of scurrying around, grabbing whatever we could. And back in the studio, people made some kind of sense out of it. Yes, my political education did occur there, not just because of what I heard at the station, but also because of what I saw as a result of being sometimes one of the people with the microphones and the tape recorders out there. A big step in my political education was observing the fact that what one was hearing about the free speech movement and the student sit-in at Sproul Hall, what we were hearing officially over the air from the major media was a pack of, because there was no question in my mind about what was actually going on when I was there with the microphone recording the sound of the student heads bouncing off the stones of the stairs as they were dragged down the inside steps of Sproul Hall. That's a great political education. Does the presence of Christ linger over a cathedral? That's the answer. He was the figure that one thought of, the sine qua non that caused it to happen, and there was a constant awareness, and one you could find yourself sometimes involved in arguments about the direction that Pacifica was taking relative to the original station that Lou Hill set up, as if you were having some sort of College of Cardinals discussion about the comparative meanings of the Gospels, or a Supreme Court interpretation of the Constitution. That was the point that one went back to, and Lou Hill was always there, hovering somewhere. What Lou Hill would think about the station today is perhaps very much like what I found that Richard Moore, who was one of the original founders, feels about the station today. That I don't want to speak on his behalf, but having had a long conversation with him, about 13 hours conversation with him rather recently, I found that the one thing that he was eager to do from the beginning was not to allow himself to be identified with any old fogey faction of people saying, "Oh, KPFA isn't what it used to be. They've deserted their principles." In fact, his contention, and it would be my contention as well, so I feel that I can say it, is that KPFA today, for all of its abrasiveness, sharp corners, creaking joints, what have you, is something much closer to what Lou Hill attempted to do in the first place than the whole area of public broadcasting as it has evolved in its more recent history, and his feeling that both in radio and in television, PBS and public radio have been edging closer and closer to the commercial networks, to the point where you have to look at the dial to be sure whether you are listening to public radio or commercial radio. I'll just throw in here that when I first came over here a few days ago, I came down for breakfast and turned on the radio to the station that was set, and I listened to a news broadcast for about 10 minutes, and I thought I was listening to a good, competent commercial news broadcast, and I suddenly found I was listening to a KQED FM, and the tone, the air sound was with little musical bits going in the background under the headlines and all the rest of it. It had the ambiance to me of commercial radio. Now, mind you, I suppose commercial radio has since gone so far that I would, if I'd been listening to that, I would think that I was listening to something from Mars. But this was his opinion, and mine as well, that the very jaggedness, the unpredictability, the constant changes, the struggles for time are more consonant with the station which it started than if it had gone on into smooth, bland, orotund deliveries of ex cathedra judgments on contemporary society, in which all the only presentations that you got of of blacks and of feminism and of Chicanos would have been very educated white males talking about them, such as me at the moment. Not very educated, just a little educated. I think that KPFA's vitality continues to depend, obviously, on two things. The vitality that is put into it by the people who do the broadcasting and the extent to which they keep themselves from settling down at any one point at all, no matter how far out in the avant-garde, because the avant-garde becomes the derrière-garde in a very short period of time, wherever you're working. But the other thing that it is dependent upon is, so long as there are people out there who want to hear what is happening to their society and what is happening particularly on the fringes of the establishment of their society, and are prepared to continue listening and continue subscribing. And I think that to a considerable extent that seems to be continuing. And when that stops happening, then the country is going to be in very sad shape indeed, and we might as well all head as far into the hills as we can get. I found, after leaving KPFA, what so many other people have found, that it is impossible to leave KPFA. You don't do it, any more than the Jesuits will allow that there is such a thing as someone who is no longer a Catholic, who was a Catholic once. And I've gone off into another career involved with sound projection for contemporary avant-garde musical events around Europe and America. And along the way, a friend of mine who I knew through an M.A. that I took at the Institute of United States Studies on American culture, American literature. This person at, of course, the University of Aarhus in Denmark asked me if I would contribute to a publication, a yearly publication of a document of theirs on this particular year devoted to America in the 1950s. And he knew that I had been at KPFA a bit earlier and asked me if I would write a history of KPFA during its first 10 years, approximately the time of Lou Hill's involvement in the station up to the time of his suicide. And this was not a time that I had intimately lived through myself, and I realized very quickly that this was a research project because I knew relatively little, only the accidents of what I had picked up. And so I started delving into the documents that I had. I talked by phone to a number of people. I carried out interviews over the telephone. Now, there was no budget for me to come over and do personal interviews, but I quickly realized that these people that I was talking to were people who had spent their lives talking to small inanimate objects, and interviewing them over a telephone was no problem at all. They would speak as freely and as expansively on the telephone as if it were into a microphone. And since this was for transcription, not for broadcast, that was no problem. And I got hours of stuff from Gert Curito, who is no longer with us, unfortunately. I got to her, and she was, one of the original founders of it, along with her husband Rick, who was the first music director. And Lou Hill, I knew, was not there to get, but through Dick Bunce, fortunately, I got Joy Hill, his widow's telephone number, and reached her. And she talked on and on and on, and I got all kinds of information about Lou Hill from her. And I did not make the choice of saying to myself, gee, why don't I go back and write something about my time at KPFA? I was dragged kicking and screaming, as it were, into it. But having been dragged there, I suddenly realized this is something that's got to be done. And it's got to be covered not just within the narrow perspective of of a dissertation on as useful and as necessary as those things are on specific aspects of the station. Its finances. It's who was sticking a knife in the back of whom at what a date. But within the whole cultural context, and as I've already said, this business of KPFA as a metaphor for American society, that it can be a means of examining what has happened to American society since 1949, what has been going on, what it has been doing, where it is going. And I've become a slave to this process, which I think may turn out to be, I would hope, the most important thing I've ever done in my life.